Everyone is born with freedom to speak, to do it his own will, to agree, to refuse. But there was a time freedom did not exist, the slavery in America. Slavery in America started in 1619 when a Dutch ship brought 20 African slaves ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. For the economic development in the so-called New World, they needed more and more labor, and throughout the 17th century, European settlers in North America turned to African slaves as a cheaper, more plentiful labor source. Though it's impossible to give accurate figures, some historians have estimated that 6 to 7 million black slaves was imported to the New World during the 18th century alone, depriving the African continent of some of its healthiest and ablest men and women. All the slaves were captured against their will and forced to across continents on ships, could have made the history of the Atlantic trade or the triangular trade. Africans who were taken from their motherland were loaded on to ships that were owned by business from all over the United States and Europe. The ships stayed to Caribbean island and the southern United States where slaves were for sale. They produced molasses in Caribbean, bringing to northern cities where it was made into rum. Some of those rum went back to Africa in trading for slaves. This cycle is called the triangular trade. How were all African slaves brought to the New World? Well, dreadfully. They were brought against their will and loaded onto horrible ships where they were chained side by side with no space to move or just to sit straight. During the whole long trip, they were provided with little or no food, no water. The extreme conditions caused between 25 and 30% of slaves death, and the rest were in bad health. But is it a luck that these people survived? I'm afraid not. On surviving after a daily journey, they were sold randomly as an item to serve in factory, cotton farm houses as a slave. Husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers were separated, missing each other forever. Slaves were totally without any human rights and weren't treated as human. After being bought, they became the property of the people who bought them. Men had to work hard and do dangerous work without any rest in return for poor food, rough clothing, and housing. The punishment for disobedience or attempts to escape was severe, painful, and tortured. Women had to work until the day of childbirth and had to come back to work immediately after giving birth. The child of a slave mother was born a slave too, and they began working at the age of 5. Most slave children were exposed to many traumas by the very nature of their enslavement. Poor diet and prenatal condition and lack of medical care led to a high rate of infant mortality. The death rate for white children at this time were approximately 20.9, whilst that for black children was double, 26.3, and the average life of a slave was very short, just 22 years old, half that of whites at the time. Slave rebellion did occur within the system, not just once, many times, but few were successful. The slave revolt that most terrified white slaveholders was that led by Nat Turner in Southern County, Virginia in August 1831. Turner's group, which eventually numbered around 75 blacks, murdered some 60 whites in 2 days before armed resistance from local whites and the arrival of state militia forces overwhelmed them. Even though slave rebellion never succeeded to free them from slavery, it had left white slaveholders in fear. Amistad was one of the documentary films about slave rebellion in America that based on a true story about slave shipping on La Amistad ship. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and on January 1st, 1863, he made it officially that slaves within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. By freeing some 3 million black slaves in the rebel states, the Emancipation Proclamation deprived the Confederacy of the bulk of its labor force and put international public opinion strongly on the Union side. Some people think that slavery ended with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, where he declared all slaves in the United States free. But this was only the first step. Only setting the slaves free wouldn't help. Slavery as a whole needed to be made illegal and prosecutable by law. For this reason, the 13th Amendment was passed. Although slaves were legally set free by Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation, there were still plenty of slaves that didn't know that they had been set free. Texas was fairly isolated and news traveled slowly. Texas was also one of the rebel southern states where President Lincoln's authority was not always recognized, and there was not big enough Union presence to enforce the law. When Major General Jordan Granger then arrived in Galveston with his troops on June 19, 1865, the news that the war was over and the slaves were set free became a huge celebration, even though it was over 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Today, Juneteenth is the oldest known celebration that commemorates the end of slavery in the U.S., which people still celebrate today.